I think we can turn the page and move to our next topic, which is the ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people. Just terrible stories every day, it seems, unfortunately. More killed in the West Bank, earlier today for us. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Ali Abunimah, who is the director of the Electronic Intifada and the author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene and Rania. It's always good to talk to you.
Well, it's always good to talk to you, and this is, coinciding here, our conversation with Mr. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor of the United States of America, being in Israel. And I just, I was looking at some of the coverage earlier today, and they're, making it seem like the U.S. is going over there to talk tough to Netanyahu or something. But, we also had the issue with them saying they're going to continue to build the embassy in East Jerusalem. So maybe this is an obvious question. In some ways, the answer is obvious, Ali. But I mean, where are we with the Biden administration here on quote unquote U.S.-Israel policy?
Right. Well, Joe Biden made clear as soon as Netanyahu was elected in November that he reaffirmed that the U.S.-Israel relationship is unshakable, that the U.S. will stand by Israel, and they have done that. Where we see some U.S. discomfort, and when I say U.S., I mean more broadly than the Biden administration, but let's say the U.S. liberal elites, the New York Timeses, the NPRs, the Democratic Party, is discomfort with the, let's call it unwokeness of the new Israeli government, in the sense that this is a government that contains people who are openly homophobic, that want to curtail the independence of the judiciary, and other attacks on what are considered liberal rights for Israelis. So what they're concerned about is that it will get harder to market Israel as a democracy, and therefore to justify the unconditional U.S. support. None of this concern from Jake Sullivan has anything to do with the Palestinians. The Biden administration, the Democratic Party, the United States government as a whole is perfectly happy for Israel to keep killing Palestinians, as Israel is doing every day, and do nothing about it. It's today, January 19th. January 12th was the first anniversary of the Israeli army abducting, brutalizing, and killing Omar Assad, a 78-year-old Palestinian great-grandfather, in fact, a Palestinian American who had spent 40 years working his butt off, him and his wife, raising their family in Wisconsin and running grocery stores. And he went back home to the West Bank, built his dream house in his village, and then was beaten to death and left for dead by the Israeli army that's armed and funded by the U.S. A few months after that, Israel murdered in broad daylight on camera Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American, world-famous journalist. Nothing from the Biden administration, no accountability. That's the bottom line. That's it. You can still kill Palestinians and do it with total impunity. And Israel has done that literally every day, I think, since the start of this year.
But no, Ali, to build off of what you're saying here, and you made a really good point about how a lot of this is really about trying to protect Israel's image, right? This is the problem, is that these people who are in charge make Israel look really bad because some of them are openly fascist. I encourage people to go watch the episode.
Which would be fine if they were in Ukraine, by the way. Sorry to interrupt.
Then it would be perfectly fine.
Just
no problem.
Context is everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good point. But I do encourage people to go watch the episode that I did with you recently on Dispatches, where we actually went through and talked about some of the figures, the really frightening figures in this government because of their open fascism. But another aspect that we'll see here before we get into maybe more of what's happening in the West Bank is what's happening in 48. really inside the Israeli Jewish community, right? There does seem to be this sort of, I don't want to call it a fight, I would call it more of an argument between the sort of right-wing religious zealots, the right-wing religious Zionists, and the sort of secular Zionists that want a pretty face on Israel. And you see that argument also mirrored inside the U.S. That's what the New York Times is upset about, right? That's what the Biden administration is upset about. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because we do, of course, see these anti-Netanyahu protests that Israeli Jews are participating in. So I'm just curious, having, you're observing what's taking place sort of within the Israeli Jewish Zionist camp and the argument taking place there. Is that significant? Does it matter? What's happening there?
Well, Israel is a settler colonial society, so that's an argument among settlers. There was there were differences, political differences between the whites in apartheid South Africa. During the final years of the apartheid regime, you had stiff competition among white supremacist parties, and some were more liberal white supremacists and others were more sort of hardline or traditional. I don't know how you classify white supremacists, but they were all white supremacists. And another analogy, I would say, of course, none of these are exact, but it's a little bit like, you could say that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party do have some differences in social policy. So, for example, on social rights, on abortion, on LGBTQ rights, you see some sharp differences among, mainstream Democrats and many Republicans. But when it comes to war, there's no difference. When it comes to the brutal policies at the U.S. border, there's no difference. When it comes to continuing to fund police forces that murder American citizens essentially just for being black, there's no difference. There's no substantial difference. Sometimes they talk slightly differently, but the policies don't really change. And that's how it is with Israel. Of course, everything there is sharpened by the fact that this is, of course, the U.S. is also a settler colonial society, but the sharpness of it in Israel is due to the intensity of the conflict with the Palestinians. But this is of no interest to Palestinians. You don't see any, and I think the emblematic thing was that at this big anti-Netanyahu protest in Tel Aviv the other day, some people showed up with Palestinian flags and they were promptly beaten by the protesters and sort of roughed up and pushed out. So this is sort of the equivalent of American liberals protesting against Donald Trump being a Russian agent. I mean, that's honestly the level I would put it on, because where were these people? Where were these tens or hundreds of thousands of Israelis when Israel was bombing Gaza and murdering Palestinians in their beds, or when Israeli snipers were being ordered to murder Palestinian children during the Great March of Return in 2018? There were maybe a couple of dozen Israelis who showed up in Tel Aviv, but not or hundreds of thousands. So it's important not to confuse any of this for any kind of fundamental challenge to the settler colonial privilege that all these people have. They just have a different vision of what that settler privilege should look like.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, talking about challenges to the settler colonialism, I think, of course, it's rightfully noted that many Palestinians are being brutally murdered all across the West Bank. But the other aspect of this, Ali, to me, is I think for the past, few years, it's felt like the center of gravity of the resistance was really in Gaza. But now it seems that there is perhaps the Palestinian struggle could always be described as irrepressible. But it does seem that, especially in Jenin, which of course has a long history, that there's a strong resurgence of a new generation of people who are just refusing to be silenced.
That's right. Now, a lot of the violence we see in the West Bank is the result of Israeli attacks on Palestinian communities, which are motivated by Israel's fear of this resurgent Palestinian armed resistance in the West Bank. Because 20 years ago, during the Second Intifada, Israel basically, with the help of the Palestinian Authority, crushed much of the armed resistance in the West Bank, pacified the West Bank, you could say. To not completely, but to a significant extent. And once Israel went in and brutally pacified, particularly Jenin and other places in the West Bank, but Jenin in particular was a center of armed resistance, the Palestinian Authority has been Israel's enforcer, making sure that there is no resurgence of armed resistance against Israel. So despite the rhetoric where Israeli leaders often attack Mahmoud Abbas, the reality is that they are very closely allied with Abbas, who they depend on. And what has been happening in the past year or two is this resurgence of a very capable armed resistance that doesn't seem to be tied to any of the traditional political factions. It seems to be independent of Fatah, of Hamas, of Islamic Jihad, and it is taking on the Israeli army in ways that Israel hasn't seen in a long time. And this is happening in a context where the Palestinian Authority is just simply on its way out. Mahmoud Abbas is in his 80s. He's and not in great health. He's extremely unpopular. He is a US/Israeli puppet or client, like so many others around the world. And when he goes, there is a great fear that the PA will simply collapse. And so Israel is trying to get ahead of this perspective by trying to preemptively take out this resistance. And I don't think they're going to be able to, but that is the driver of some of Israel's panic and its daily attacks on refugee camps, on cities like Jenin and Nablus, all over the place, in an attempt to try to crush this resistance, because Israel can no longer rely on the Palestinian Authority. And I expect with this new government, which is even more open, and it's not a quantitative, it's sort of a rhetorical difference. They will go out and actively seek violence, and so I think that the year ahead is going to be could be very, very difficult, in the sense that Palestinians are going to face even more violence from Israel and will be in a position where they'll have no option but to resist. Resistance for Palestinians is an existential necessity as well as being a right.
And Israel has a great deal to lose in a lot of this, especially given regional dynamics at the moment. I mean, in many ways, this really shows that despite Israel's incredibly complex system of, for years, very effective population control is like a nice way to put it. Despite all of that, despite the extensive surveillance systems that they have in place, the occupation they have in place, the walls they have in place, despite all of that, they haven't been able to pacify Palestinians. Maybe there was a brief period of time where the West Bank seemed pacified, but it's quite the opposite moving forward. And I guess I'm just curious, Ali, do you see this getting bloodier?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do, and I've been saying that for a while because there is no prospect for Israel. And remember now, the Palestinian people between the river and the sea. So when I say that, I mean in what is called Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, is the majority. They are the numerical majority. The ruling Jewish community is the minority. It may be a narrow minority, you know, it sort of maybe 48% Jewish, really know exactly. But the point is that this isn't a situation of a majority oppressing 10% of the population. This is less than half the population trying to impose a supremacist regime on the majority. And that is not sustainable in the long run. There isn't a technology, there isn't a surveillance system, there isn't a wonder weapon, there isn't a propaganda strategy that can forever force a people to live in this subordinate system under a brutal regime of apartheid, occupation, and settler colonialism. All Israel has ever been able to do is to do what they call conflict management for periods of time, different tactics and strategies to try to buy time. But the confrontation is coming. And the only way out that can provide people with a decent life, and when I say people, I mean everyone in the country, Palestinians, but Israeli Jews as well, is an end to the Jewish supremacist regime. You cannot have peace under white supremacist apartheid in South Africa. You cannot have peace under Jim Crow and segregation in the United States. And you cannot have peace under Zionism in Palestine. Zionism is the antithesis of peace, justice, and equality. It is a violent attack on the indigenous people. It is an attempt to erase them. It is a form of genocide because remember that this Netanyahu government that just came to power put in its basic guidelines, in other words, the coalition agreement that provides the platform for the government, that the Jewish people alone has the right to all the land in what they call the land of Israel. But what they mean by that is historic Palestine. So they deny the existence and rights of the Palestinian people. That's a genocidal view, that the Palestinians don't exist or shouldn't exist. And so, yes, this will get more bloody, unfortunately, but the Palestinians are in a situation where the Palestinians haven't chosen violence. Israel has chosen the violence. The settler colonial regime is inherently violent, and Palestinians are finding that they have no choice but to defend themselves. That's always been the case, but it's not, unfortunately, that dynamic is not going to lessen in the immediate future. The end game is there has to be an end to the Zionist regime of settler colonialism and racism, and some kind of liberatory regime and decolonization. That shouldn't be controversial. That's the reality, but it's something we're still in deep denial about in the United States, in the mainstream. And I think what we're seeing now is this panic over the loss of the last vestiges of the liberal fig leaf that Israel has been able to maintain for a while. And people are starting to see Israel as Palestinians have always seen it. The face of Israel that people are suddenly waking up to and saying, my goodness, these people are crazy, these people are fascist, these people are extremists, is the face Palestinians have never been able to escape. And Israel is doing it because they've seen there's no consequences to it. The weapons will keep flowing, the money will keep flowing from the US and the EU. So the final point I'll make on this is to remember that the fate of the Palestinian people, or the oppression of the Palestinian people, is intricately tied to U.S. imperialism. Where goes the U.S. empire, Israel goes with it. The decline of the U.S. empire is necessary for the liberation of the Palestinian people and people across the region.
Well, as always, Ali, we really appreciate you making time for us, and we couldn't recommend the Electronic Intifada more highly. Hopefully everyone has it in their daily media diet. But of course, thanks again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
My pleasure. Thank you.